Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We have many people joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm a historian of science and director of the Center for Science and Society. I'm really thrilled to welcome you all here tonight. Our distinguished panelists, Professors Julia Say, Samuel Roberts, and Jason Bordoff. We're very lucky to have you all with us tonight. And of course, we're lucky to have all of you in the audience as well. Before I give the floor to our panelists, I'd like to briefly introduce the center and share the inspiration for the Climate and Society series. The Center for Science and Society brings together researchers, scholars, and practitioners in the natural and social sciences, humanities, law, medicine, and the arts to engage in interdisciplinary research, teaching, and outreach. The center works to reduce and eliminate traditional disciplinary silos, create new hubs of interdisciplinary teaching and research, and enhance public understanding of science. All these activities align the center with the aims of the newly founded Columbia Climate School. The Climate School also strives to form a hub of interdisciplinary research, education, and practice focused on climate and its related challenges. Complex phenomena, such as climate change, are so multidimensional that they need researchers in social and human behavior, culture, politics and policy, economics, communication, and many other areas. They need more than just a scientific or technological lens. For all these reasons, I'm delighted and very grateful to be collaborating together on this series with our event co-sponsors, the Columbia Climate School, the Office of the Dean of Humanities, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and the Climate and Society MA program. The Climate and Society series showcases work on climate, environment, sustainability, and its social and cultural dimensions. So let me just do a little housekeeping here. To participate in today's event, audience members can type your questions into the chat. Please direct them to the host, Audience Q&A. So please type your questions into the chat, Audience Q&A. Or you can raise your virtual hand during the Q&A session at the end of the event, and I'll call on you. The Climate and Society lecture series continues with 2 more events in the rest of this semester. So November 16th and December 7th. Now I'd like to introduce to you Professor Jason Bordoff, who will chair today's event. Dr. Bordoff is co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School and founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy, professor of professional practice in international and public relations at the School of International and Public Affairs. Before his appointment at Columbia, Bordoff served as special assistant to President Barack Obama and senior director for Energy and Climate Change on the staff of the National Security Council and held senior policy positions on the White House's National Economic Council and Council on Environmental Quality. Professor Bordoff is one of the world's leading energy and climate policy experts. His research and policy interests lie at the intersection of economics, energy, environment, and national security. He's written prolifically about how to address our greatest energy and climate change challenges and has developed innovative programs and tools to train future leaders to bridge the gap between academic research and policy. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Jason Bordoff to introduce our speaker and respondent tonight.
Thank you, Pamela, for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being with us for this really timely conversation. Spent time earlier today, various ways making preparations for the world coming together in Glasgow in a few weeks to see whether the world is going to be able to elevate its ambition when it comes to climate and hopefully match that ambition with real action, which we're not on track to do today. And climate justice and a just transition is just a central element, more and more central than even in the past, to the climate conversation and to the international discussions that are happening about it. Who bears the responsibility historically for the cumulative emissions to date? Who bears the cost, not only of climate change and its impacts, but who bears the cost of climate action? When we think about what I spend a lot of time on, how to design climate policy, how do we make sure that is done in an equitable way? How do we make sure that the opportunities created by climate action, there'll be a lot of new industries, new jobs, are shared equally? How do we think about the parts of the world that use very little energy today, have not contributed much at all, if at all, to the problem? And how do we think about what a just transition looks like from the standpoint of parts of the world that still have a lot of development and growth to do? And there are many other aspects to the topic of this session. How can climate action address past and ongoing dispossession and colonialism? So all those international concerns and domestic concerns are central to the conversation we're having in the US right now about whether Congress will be able to meaningfully pass important climate action of even a fraction of the sort that was put forward in Biden's plan, and how close that can get us to where we need to be for net zero 2050 targets. And discussion about how today's climate policies can reckon with America's own history of injustice when we think about climate change, environmental justice issues, air pollution, and much more, and what a just transition looks like moving forward. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from two fantastic people tonight about many of these issues. We're lucky to be joined by two of the leading experts on this, who have a wealth of knowledge about these subjects, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So to that end, I will turn first to Dr. Julie Zee, as you heard, a professor of American Studies at UC Davis, also the founding director of the Environmental Justice Project for UC Davis's John Muir Institute for the Environment, and the faculty advisor for 25 Stories from the Central Valley. She's a renowned expert on race and equality, environmental justice, and no one I can think of that I am more interested to hear from about the topics we just talked about, and then we'll turn to Dr. Roberts for a response. Julie, over to you.
Let me share my screen. This is the first time in 2 years I have done this from my office and not from my desk. And so there's a precarious cereal box situation here and stuff. So I wanted to thank you again for that introduction, and thank you for the invite to present on this. Hold on. Okay, so today I want to talk about climate justice and just transitions. Obviously, from Jason's introduction, huge topics, that we're not going to solve or, really get to a lot. But I think what I want to do is to introduce these topics and think about the politics of recognition, restoration, and reparations. I think, we will see that these conversations will just get more and more intense. And I think it's good to have a framework for understanding, what the conversations will be in an anticipatory, productive way, so that, there isn't surprise when, the different politics play themselves out. I wanted to thank Joseph for all his help organizing this event, and to Professor Pamela Smith for the intervention within the Center for Science and Society to make sure that interdisciplinary and humanistic perspectives are important to this story. I was very intrigued to learn about the climate school at Columbia. And so it's a real gift to be able to come and share time with you. In between my two classes, I actually got a puppy sitter for the first time. I did the whole pandemic puppy everything. So this question of why interdisciplinary perspectives are important is something that I have been thinking about for a long time. As somebody who's trained in American studies, but who has been working on environmental justice for over 28 years. And I think early on in my career, there was this kind of sense of like, well, what did someone from American studies or ethnic studies or gender studies, what can you offer? There was this sense from community perspectives that you really needed like practical public health or quantitative sociological approaches. And, in the 28 years since I've been starting to do this work, I've been thinking more confidently and more importantly that it's actually central to have humanists and interdisciplinary perspectives. And this is a conversation that, I've been engaged with on this campus, which is a very environmental science heavy campus, ag science heavy campus, but also more broadly in the field of sustainability and sustainability studies. And so I edited a book in 2018 that asked this question of what is empirical documentation? We're in a moment politically where there's a lot of empirical documentation about the problems. That wasn't true 28 years ago when I started doing this research. So now the harder, much harder, I think, question. And again, it's not to say that we don't need empirical documentation, but empirical documentation, as we well know, is not enough in and of itself. And so this question of the how and the I can't even see because it's cut off by the speakers. The how is a political question. It's also a historical, cultural question. And so in this edited collection, we really, and this is a collaborative edited collection that really talks about situating sustainabilities rather than sustainability as a thing, but as a process itself. And so this question of interdisciplinarity in sustainability is also, I think, the same parallel conversations within environmentalism, within climate justice, and so on. And so where I come from, just to put my cards out on the table, is to really think about what kinds of questions are being asked, and what not to be against solutionism per se, but to go against a kind of reflexive solutionism or a move to technocratic policy fixes without thinking about history, without thinking about politics, and so on. And so we need, I think, in sustainability, in climate justice, in environmental justice, in environmentalism, a radical interdisciplinarity. So, my colleague, Mary Catanasso, the urban ecologist, says, in her plant science department, interdisciplinary means a root person working with a STEM person. So in my world, I work with, scientists, engineers, community members, and so on. So for me, this interdisciplinarity and the question of curriculum is always driven by this need of, yes, the urgency of the problem that we're facing, but really a profound belief that we need interdisciplinarity to really engage with it seriously. So I wanted to just say that. So the overview of the topic today is to introduce really the idea of climate justice praxis, the movements and the theories, and the language of just transition. I think what we can see in just transition and climate justice, as those terms are being more accepted and normalized, we can see, as someone who's been working on environmental justice for over 28, almost 30 years at this point, there's a time when the term becomes more acceptable, but then also it becomes more vague and in some ways less helpful. And so what I want to suggest is that we're in a moment where the transition in part is not just the just transition from a carbon to a post-carbon world, but a transition from the politics of recognition to that of restoration and reparations in a moment of danger broadly defined. So the question that orients the talk for me is, how do climate justice movements theorize and imagine what just transition means in light of the histories and ongoing legacies of colonialism and capitalism? And this is preliminary work from a short book I'm working on called Climate Justice as Freedom. And so it's not done. So that's why I'm also excited to hear your feedback and reactions. So just transition, there's a lot of work that's been done on this. Oh, and this actually, I don't know where this comes from somebody else. I'm not trying to plagiarize. I just had to, report a student to plagiarism. I must have hidden that slide. This is, there's a lot of that's already been written about just transition. And so I think, these are some of the articles that, have been already written about this, around distribution, procedure, restoration, and so on. So I'm building upon a foundation that's already active both in the academic realm, obviously, but also in the activist realm. And so, here it is. These slides come from Darren McCauley. The need for an interdisciplinary approach on just transition. And so, I'm not a big believer in, sole authorship, taking credit and so on. So I think, there's a lot of work that, again, has already been produced on this. So what I want to do is do an outline that talks about environmental racism and climate justice as violence, or in other words, how we think about just transition and how it's conceptualized matters. Obviously, that's a takeoff on Black Lives Matter and so on. I want to talk briefly about environmental justice and mode of danger, the key questions and argument. Oh, that did not. And then, which in some ways I've been working on the same question and arguments for quite a while. And they are the same questions and arguments that are in this new book, Climate Justice as Freedom, around the idea of a critical climate justice perspective. Climate justice, what restorative justice might mean, and the politics of just transitions, and then turn it over to a Q&A. Okay, so the problems. What I wanted to start with is the idea that the US and the world is burning, flooding, and exploding. We understand that authoritarianism, political authoritarianism is linked with racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, gender violence, militarism, and corporate capitalism. That these crises are interconnected, police and state-sanctioned violence, pandemic, public health, and climate disaster is more apparent to more around the world than ever before. Those who protest against fascist and extreme economic and social inequality made exponentially worse under COVID. The climate crisis has come home to roost in the shape of hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires, and the old political order is crumbling. What takes place is now under fierce political struggle. The action in the streets, in the classrooms, and in stories shaped and are shaped by government chambers and corporate boardrooms. And so when Trump came to California after the wildfires last year, he blamed Californians for not raking leaves, despite the fact that 57% of California forests are under federal control. He, like many others, mixes weather and climate, and said it was getting cooler. But despite a president and millions of Americans who believe that facts don't matter, whether that's drinking bleach or it was cool weather, so climate disaster doesn't disappear because you wish it to be so. It seems horrific and depressing to say this explicitly, but acting as if facts and science don't matter only makes problems worse. Denial is a prison, and we need freedom now. We are dying in a world that colonialism created, that industrial modernity made exponentially worse, which transnational corporations under neoliberalism is trying to finish off. But we also live in a rich and beautiful world made even more precarious under threats, environmental or otherwise. So this talk is focused on a very specific standpoint, that of climate and environmental justice movements. Climate justice and environmental justice focus sharply and with laser-like precision on issues of power, history, and knowledge. So my arguments today echo and interpret those made by those in the struggle for environmental justice and climate justice, especially those that sit foreground what they call frontline and fence line perspectives. Those perspectives are the voices and perspective and worldviews of those most impacted and least responsible for these pollution and problems. What they again call themselves frontline, fence line perspectives, comprised by and led by people of color, indigenous peoples, and the poor, what some are now calling the people of the global majority. So I think this question of recognition is a really important one. And, in terms of understanding what the source of these problems are, Jason already said this, we understand that climate injustice is violence in the sense of disasters, and their impacts and injustices are magnified through these lens of injustices. So climate justice movements reject climate change, both causes and responses, as divorced from history, politics, economic domination, and how these saturate and remake global social and racial inequalities. Environmental justice activists reject environmental issues, air, water, et cetera, pesticides, toxicity, siting, and drought, as separate from each other or separate from domains of public health and land use, and also divorced from the structure of economic and political life. Climate justice movements in the US and globally use the term frontline to foreground these issues of race and racism, class, inequality, indigeneity, citizenship, and gender to highlight the disparities of, again, who is most impacted and least responsible for climate disasters, which they know will hit and continue to land on them particularly hard. And so in all of the work I do, I always highlight the frontline and fence line perspectives to take seriously the argument from the Climate Justice Alliance, and this is a quote: frontline community-based organizations have the solutions to the extractive industrial systems that are eroding humans' primary means of existence on the planet. Climate justice movements are anti-racist in their rejection of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. They're decolonial in their centering of indigeneity, feminist orientation. They bend towards anti-capitalist critique of marketization, consumerism, and militarization, and oil and gas cultures. Environmental justice movements have long argued for making connections that exceed and defy these binaries. For example, dividing social and environmental and economic, and against the capitalist common sense. In a brutalizing era focused on death and natural resource extraction and punctuated by a never-ending litany of apocalyptic scientific forecasts, climate justice movements contribute their stories, their histories, and their justice-oriented worldviews based on these intersectional and political perspectives that span historical time and geographic space. So I think what I want to say is that environmental justice and climate change, has been a core part of the environmental justice movement for a very long time. I remember as an organizer in New York in the late 90s, seeing the Environmental Justice and Climate Change Coalition, and they had a fact sheet that was talking about what would happen if a Category 5 hurricane hit New Orleans. And I remember in 1997 reading it and going, this can't happen. This is dystopian science fiction. I was an English major, so I was like, this is just a novel. This is not going to happen. Of course, everything that the EJCC said is exactly what happened in 2005 in Hurricane Katrina. And so, again, this question of distribution, this question of procedural, and these questions of which I think, Hurricane Katrina was and does remain a really important opening salvo to the moment of danger that we're in right now. And so these are a couple of images of from the book that I talk about in the 3rd chapter on climate justice, including Relocate Kivalina, which is an Arctic indigenous community, Inupiaq, that sued 25 oil and gas companies for the harm to climate change. They lost the lawsuit because the Ninth Circuit said that this was not a legal issue, but a cultural, economic one. Again, it's this very separation that, justice movements and justice activists reject. So, I think we all know this in terms of the disasters and the exacerbation of them. Here's another visualization of sort of where we're at. Again, this goes along with my point about empirical documentation. Myself being a Gen Xer, I didn't grow up with climate change, and my children, they and this generation behind us has always grown up with this knowledge of it. And so, I think that there's important, affective and interpersonal and psychological work and questions about what does knowing all this mean? What does knowing actually lead to action, or is it a paralyzing force? And I think that's an important part of what justice movements offer, is both a critique, but a rejection of that kind of climate nihilism. Here's another map of global injustices. Red is, worst impacts and so on. But, if you read this, oh, my light automatically goes off. I'm sorry. I want my light to go on, but I don't know how to make it go back on. Okay. So this is also a colonial map, or a post-colonial map, or an enduring colonial map. And so, very simply put, many IPCC reports, have quantified what that climate change will expand and magnify inequality. And so, just most recently, Code Red for Humanity. There are many articles again on just transition. I think I like this one that says a just transformation is not just a low carbon version of the current one. So again, that question of, what are we transitioning to? What are we transitioning for? If just transition is only about carbon, which is not to say that that's not important and central, but it cannot be sufficient in and of itself. That the just part of it, the justice part of it, that justice activists argue for, is actually central. So I want to talk briefly about my book, and then I want to make sure we have a lot of time for questions. And so I wrote this book recently called Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. It's part of the American Studies Now series, and the royalties for this book go to the Community Water Center and Uprose in Sunset Park. My actual, research originally, this is how I know Sam, is from New York. I wrote a book called Noxious New York, and I've been working with Uprose since I was 22. And so this is, a book that is in some ways, based on, a long time relationship, which I think is an important part of justice movements. It's about the relationship building itself. And so the book structure is a very simple. It links case studies with keywords in the field of American studies, ethnic studies, gender studies, and so on. And I think, again, that it's been interesting, as I get older, and I remember taking race, poverty, and environment with Carl Anthony, and he's an important African-American architect and founder of Urban Habitat in the Bay Area. And for me, this was new knowledge. Again, remember, I went to college before there was the internet. And so I remember seeing transparencies that were linking racial demographics and lead and asthma, and just being like, my mouth like just dropped. Like GIS did not exist. well, in the interim of, my adulthood, that's a very different reality. And social media has also very much changed what people know. And I can see it even in my students. My students know much more coming in. There isn't as much of a sort of surprise at the scope of the problem. So, and I think we have to basically do a different kind of teaching as well, and different kind of training. And so it's, but on the other side of that, people coming in with that knowledge is that it can also be overwhelming. And there's things that, happen and people already forget. Like in my class right now, many of my students, they were 4 years old, 5 years old when Hurricane Katrina happened. Hurricane Maria has already passed from memory, for many people. And so, again, there's both more knowledge, but also, it's harder sort of to put your finger on things. So what I wanted to do in this book is to talk about case studies, but to talk about them within the frameworks of these, the scholarship that comes from these fields, but also anchor it within organizations. Because I think, the main part of the argument of the book is that the question is, what crossroads and moment of danger are we in now? And what might we learn from environmental justice movements in our moment of danger? And of course, I wrote this book before COVID. COVID, again, makes everything worse. And the third chapter talks about restoring environmental justice, talks about Katrina, Hurricane Maria, Kivalina, the idea of troubling carbon and capitalism, and the politics of a non-naive radical hope. And the question, that I hope that we start to really have more deeply is, what does restorative environmental justice mean? What can it mean, given the histories and legacies of colonialism and capitalism and racism that we all live with and in today? The argument of the book is fairly simple, that environmental justice movements are freedom struggles that are particularly significant now, that they're intersectional, and that the justice movements themselves cross time and space. Environmental justice as a freedom movement means engaging, again, with history, violence, imaginary and visionary perspectives. So there's a lot of poetry, hip hop, kind of storytelling around these issues. And environmental justice is a structure of feeling. And, for those of you who are literary scholars, you know that this is Raymond Williams' idea of structure of feeling. What environmental justice movements and climate justice movements offer, I think most principally, is a rejection of the emotions and affects of despair, as they always have. Their modes are principled resistance, survival, life affirmation against capital accumulation and economic growth, and a politics of solidarity that's based on radical empathy, humor, grace, and transformation. Again, this idea of a non-naive radical hope. It's not naive because it's grounded in lived experience and intergenerational trauma and violence. It's radical because the politics refuse reformist politics of making unjust system simply more racially diverse or tolerable. And these politics are based on hope, resistance, and solidarity between communities and ecosystems already made vulnerable to death, injustice, and violence. And so in sharp contrast to a denuded generic climate justice framework, which means nothing, frontline climate justice posits a fundamentally different worldview and stories of freedom than that which currently exists in the political and economic and cultural systems that we live in today. So again, these are some images of the examples I talk about, including one of my favorite films ever on Hurricane Katrina called Trouble the Water, which again, I highly recommend if you haven't seen to check out. And so there is important theoretical and practice-oriented work already being done around what I call critical climate justice. And movements have already produced substantial guiding principles such as the Just Transition Framework, the indigenous principles of just transition. And their analysis and theoretical contributions can be found in groups like Dissenters, which links abolition against police and abolition against the military with a climate struggle. The Movement Generation Collective based in Oakland. Alliances, again, like the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Just Transition Alliance, and the Climate Justice Alliance. And in local groups all around the US and the world that share convergent perspectives of frontline leaders and theorists. And they have produced remarkable documents like the Red Deal for Climate Justice from the Red Nation, the Red, Black, and Green New Deal from the Movement for Black Lives, and in hundreds of local groups. Of course, the older principles, environmental justice, Bali principles, and environmental justice. I really like the 2002 principles of working together because there's this amazing, line about we need each other and are stronger with each other. So environmental justice and climate justice movements, theories, and perspectives are well suited then, not only just for understanding our current moment of danger, but in fighting it. The interconnectedness of deeply rooted crises of climate change, toxicity, global white supremacy, and the rise of authoritarian populism is ever clearer. And again, many scholars are linking COVID, climate, and violence in important ways as co-produced crises which necessitate intersectional analyses of overlapping and uneven conditions of great harm. Where justice movements, I think, matter collectively, and again, this is not just climate justice, but also criminal justice, gender justice, reproductive justice, et cetera, is rejecting the naturalization of disproportionate harm and in rejecting never-ending death and destruction. Whereas the dominant response is to normalize the shifting baselines, whether that's acceptable COVID or in degree temperatures warmed, justice movements connect seemingly acceptable sets of facts and reject these as inevitable or acceptable. And so just transition, I think, in a lot of ways is similar to the just recovery arguments that are happening, and that I think framing and how problems are being talked about leads to different pathways of responses, action, and research. And so these old paradigms of knowledge production, of research, of policy analysis are not sufficient for the reality that we're in. There is no new normal to return to, in other words. And so what I want to briefly show here is this is the strategy framework for just transition that came out of the Movement Generation Our Power campaign. And you can find this online here. And so this is a very different idea of the just transition. So on the one hand, you have the extractive economy, and then you have this living economy. And here let me get in more closely. So if you look at the extractive economy, you have oil, right? Extraction, dig, burn, and dump, leave it and keep it in the ground, absolutely essential. But some of the other parts of extraction that they critique are consumerism, colonialism, enclosure, and militarism. And then in terms of what they were moving towards in the regenerative economy, it's about deep democracy, ecological social well-being, cooperations, caring and sacredness, and a different politics of wealth, value, and so on. Going back to, so most places about, most discussions of just transition don't really talk about, say, consumerism or colonialism or militarism. But this just transition framework, I think, is a really powerful one that encapsulates, I would argue, the frontline perspective on climate justice and the just transition. Jason mentioned this. When I saw this, I said, even if it doesn't really work in with any talk, I will always get it in there. As an American Studies scholar, it's really important to me. So, this, I think some of you already know this, the US is responsible for 25% of cumulative carbon emissions since 1750. Until 1882, the largest was United Kingdom because of empire. And so the US military, currently with 800 military bases around the world, would by itself be the 58th highest carbon emitter if it was its own country. And the military is, secures access to oil, extractive resources, and it has a part of the single largest carbon footprint of any entity on Earth. And so, one of the things I'm working on right now is the Marshallese diaspora, which is both vulnerable to climate change because of, as a small island state, they also have the highest per capita COVID rates. And so this question of restoration, of reparations, of a sort of living with militarism and legacies of militarism and toxicity in their bodies, I think is, the Marshallese is a really important, and, again, not just the Marshallese, many of the small island states. But I wanted to talk about, if you haven't seen the opening of the 2014 UN Climate Summit, 26-year-old Marshallese poet Kathy Gentile Kajiner read a poem to her 7-month-old daughter, where she talks about it as the line, because we're going to fight. And I think her poetry represents this critical climate justice perspective that highlights, again, this politics and cultural production of non-naive radical hope in global climate justice movements in the face of existential threats. And so her activism and storytelling, along with countless others, sing a collective soundtrack of freedom and of resistance in a world on fire, facing floods, droughts, and ocean death, both the hurricanes, earthquakes, and the tidal waves. So climate justice movements envision and act upon their non-naive radical hope built on these capacious foundations of love, art, creativity, restoration, political resistance, collaborative relationships, and humor. And there's a lot of humor in the face of this calamitous global present built on the funeral pyres of colonialism and capitalism dependent on stolen land and labor. So abolitionist climate justice, I'm working on a paper that is talking about this. And I also wanted to just highlight, if any of you have not seen the North Pole, it's a very amazing series actually generated by Movement Generation that has a lot of these kind of radical politics of the frontline climate justice worldview, which they argue, again, must lead policy and practice and their worldviews into the just transition, which is, they define capaciously to include, but not only be limited to a post-carbon world. The agenda, therefore, is of decarbonization, of course, but also a different world, of a different vision of the world that is against oil, whiteness, and capitalism. Frontline climate justice activists distinguish their position against mainstream technologically driven conversations around climate policy on a range of topics, from carbon fundamentalism and the simplification of carbon neutrality as a proxy for social justice, to even dominant framings of climate refugees. And so there's a really important book, I think, about to come out by Neil Ahuja, which is a critical ethnic studies approach to how climate refugees are talked about and envisioned. And so, again, the reparative and restorative environmental justice, climate justice movements, and even in institutions like the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and those voices from the small island states in the Pacific, in the Alaska, in Louisiana wetlands, are important emergent examples of restorative and reparative in climate and health justice. They call for responsibility, restoration, and repair that is politically and culturally significant. Ultimately, their calls uphold that decarbonization and demilitarization must be linked to address historical and structural violences and vulnerabilities across time and space, what some have called an internationalism from below. So, I think, this question of what the reparations call looks like, maybe we'll have a conversation, with Sam. I want to make sure we have a lot of time for questions. I'm really drawn, and I think the work of Olufemi Taiwo, the philosopher at Georgetown, working with his collaborator, Biba Sieberlich, all of the work that they have been doing around climate colonialism and climate, they basically say we're in this moment where we're at this crossroads of climate apartheid or climate reparations. And so they suggest, that we have to think about a reparations-based approach, say looking at climate refugees that talk about climate change mitigation and a just climate migration policy. They don't mention the climate of Marshall Islands specifically, but the case of the Marshall Islands also, I think, addresses this issue of climate reparations in a way that I think is really interesting, because they already have the right to migrate to the US because of the toxic legacy of nuclearism in there. But this idea of climate reparations encompasses practices that push climate reparations in ways further that are not really understood or readily accepted now. And so I think we're going to just see more and more conversation, debate around these. I want to, go through this. I went through this pretty quickly, but you can see this in a lot of the discussions around, what the new Green New Deal looks like, these calls for, a real radical and effective Green New Deal. But I think I want to close with two of my favorite quotes. One is the author James Baldwin, and he writes, "People who shut their eyes to reality invite their own destruction, and anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence after that is dead turns himself into a monster." So now we are in the moment of monsters, and those who seek to make their monstrosity logical, acceptable, and normal. But justice movements always remind us in their placards, music, and stories against this logical monstrosity in simple slogans such as "people and planet over profits." Critical climate justice frameworks link political and cultural struggles for decarbonization, decarceration, demilitarization, and domination over nature within decolonial and abolitionist frameworks. In other words, decarceration, a world without prisons and policing; demilitarization, a world without war and violence; and domination, a world where nature is abused and extracted through and beyond carbon, are interlinked problems. A just world for frontline climate justice activists is a remade world that takes decolonial, feminist, and abolitionist perspectives as their base for climate struggle and political transformation to overturn the legacies of colonialism and anti-Blackness, labor exploitation, and the continuing extraction and abuse of nature. Critical climate justice thus rejects hierarchical and global white supremacist visions of carbon, military, prisons, policing, and human hierarchy and domination over nature. And to do so potentially brings us an emancipatory future as guests rather than hosts and dominators of the planet. Climate justice movements stand in living and continuing solidarity with freedom struggles in the contemporary moment and those in the past, especially those coming from Black freedom, Indigenous, anti-colonial, and feminist social movements. More than just hegemonic institutions like prisons and the military, critical climate justice reject the legacies of colonialism, human domination over nature, including gendered dimensions of violence, fossil fuel extraction, and white supremacy as forces which have to be dismantled and remade. Counter hegemony is important in institutions, but it must first grow in the mind as a possibility for alternative futures. And that's why I put the Gramsci quote, because, obviously he's also talking about monsters too. In other words, the task of imaginative freedom, writing, and poetry are central, and why climate nihilism can be so dangerous. Climate cynicism, attachment to capitalist domination, and fidelity to authoritarian populism as politically inevitable work to defang political opposition to the dominant structures of power and its attendant institutions. Climate justice movements actively practice and imagine their abolitionist, counter-hegemonic radical politics by naming their enemies: neoliberalism, corporate polluters, oil and gas companies, neglectful policy struggles around immigration, asylum, climate refugees, and global white supremacy. They rally against venture capitalists, privatization proponents, developers, gentrifiers, and racist cops, including border control, patrol, and detention. They imagine the world that they want to make, one that is feminist, anti-racist, and indigenous-led, that lives with and not in hierarchical domination relation to nature, animals, and ecosystems. Only by identifying the roots and relatedness of problems, fossil capitalism, war and militarization, prison and policing of borders, and hierarchy over nature, that can the collective we begin to imagine a different post-carbon just planetary future. Frontline environmental and climate justice groups have long been fighting corporate power, state-sanctioned violence, and white supremacy for a long time. Whether you want to say it's 30 years from the naming of environmental racism and environmental justice movements, or from 1492. Climate justice aligned structures are creative in their analysis and their structure. They imagine politics differently, and they nurture and create convergence of these frontline worldviews. Without naming as such, these worldviews are imaginaries that are indebted to prefigurative radical thinkers like Grace Lee Boggs, who wrote that the genuine revolutionary task is to live now as we want to live in the future society, rather than waiting for it to be realized. Grace Lee Boggs asked us, what time is it on the clock of the world? And I think that's an important question we all have to think about now. Environmental justice movements make links within the US and across borders, and they create the cultures of solidarity. They travel between places, peoples, past, present, and future. And it is in these interconnections that justice movements are made and remade. This framework and praxis matters now more than ever as a principled base from which to face our collective planetary future. Living in denial doesn't make the problem, whether it's climate change or COVID, go away. Although most people in the US would prefer to ignore our histories and our debts to each other, in addition to our responsibility to the rest of the world, in connected to our nationalist parochialism, climate science is clear and the justice activists have been right. In 1938, poet Langston Hughes wrote his poem, Kids Who Die. It opens as follows. This is for the kids who die, black and white, for kids will die certainly. The old and rich will live on a while, as always, eating blood and gold, letting kids die. Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and climate justice activists everywhere remind us that the old and the rich eat their blood, gold, and oil, while kids, usually Black, brown, and indigenous, die. And this horror has to be recognized as a monstrosity. Environmental justice and climate justice is more than a resistance to environmental racism and colonialism, as if that wasn't enough. They're a set of concepts and living practices that cross time, generation, and space. They're a counter-hegemonic philosophy of practice, a search of freedom beyond local communities fighting bad systems. It's not just about state-centered policy, incorporation, or reformism. They challenge the status quo rather than fixing or tinkering a system grounded in domination, terror, and control, and violence and death. And their vision for environmental justice, one against eating blood, gold, and oil, is for making work, care, food, energy, and lives matter, not cheap, disposable, and dead. This is an old idea. It is not new. And it's worth remembering our collective past as a set of practitioners interested in justice of all stripes. And I don't have time to talk about Benjamin Lay, but everybody should read about Benjamin Lay. He's actually an amazing, he's why Quakers became abolitionists. The lessons of the environmental justice movement, I could say come from Grace Lee Boggs, Benjamin Lay, Langston Hughes, etc. The lessons of the environmental justice movement are in the struggles of the people and communities made vulnerable to violence, and those whose continued survival is a direct challenge to the political and economic order addicted to capitalism, carbon, and white supremacy. The significance, thus, of the environmental justice and climate justice movement is to challenge these authorities of whiteness, extraction, and violence through diverse voices, media, and perspectives. Art making and protest is life affirming in an extractive capitalist context that invites the deaths of people, natures, and planet. And revolution means engaging with radical hope and the focus on praxis and social movements. Justice and solidarity is actually everywhere if you look. And so the feeling for others can lead us away from the death cult of whiteness, carbon addiction, and capitalism. This empathy has been in too far short a supply, embedded in the political and economic systems that structure our lives. Colonialism and enslavement left ongoing legacies of extraction that rendered organized violence normal. Justice movements reject this common sense and such abstraction. Now is the moment of monsters and those who seek to make their monstrosity logical, acceptable, and normal. Again, environmental justice and climate justice reject slow deaths and fast violence. It's about living and loving beyond the shadows and the numbers, about love and creation in a moment that fetishizes death and spurns care. It's about reclaiming the ethics of morality and widening the circles to respect land and home and to acknowledge trauma and history. These horrors are monstrosities, and our urgency now is to maximize our collective convergence towards this ethic of care in the spirit of solidarity and to bend the arc of justice and freedom from oil and all forms of extraction, hierarchy, and violence. The time is now. I'll end there. Sam.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie. That was fascinating. There's so much there to go into in the conversation and tease apart, both domestic and in the international context, where at least I spend more of my time. Actually, I was just thinking of the Wall Street Journal story yesterday. I think the headline was something like, to strike a climate deal, the poor nations say they need trillions from the rich ones, as the countries that didn't cause most of the emissions you pointed out will bear the brunt of climate impacts and need help paying for the cost of the transition. A lot of things I want to come back to in the conversation, and there are already questions coming in from the audience, but let's go for a response to Sam Roberts. Dr. Roberts is Associate Professor of History, Socio-Medical Sciences, and African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia, where he also leads the research cluster for historical study of race, inequality, and health. He writes and speaks widely on African American history, medical and public health history, criminal justice, and the history of social movements. Really lucky to have you join us today and have your input. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Can everybody hear me okay? Melinda,
Yes.
I'm good? Okay, all right, fantastic. And Julie, thank you so much. This was fantastic. So much to think about. And I think I want to choose as my role someone who can help maybe tease out some of the threads. This was not a pre-circulated paper, so this is my first time hearing it. So I'm going to dispense with the kind of 5-minute kind of elongated response, and rather maybe just go straight to pitching some questions for you or to you. You did send me a draft of I believe it was the introduction of the book that you're working on, so that was certainly very useful. And I was really delighted to read as much as I could of your book from last year as well. I can't believe you're starting another book right after that. I thought you were supposed to take like a little breather or something after you finish a book, but I'm really happy and excited to hear and read more about your current work. There are a couple of things that stood out to me. I mean, there's a lot going on here, and I think this book is going to lay out the stakes. I think you have clearly in this talk, put down a gauntlet for what climate justice means, or what it should mean, a la particularly the movements that you study. I was struck by a number of things in your talk today. And first, I want to bring out your assertion that that climate justice, and I forgot the exact quote. I think I tried to write it down, but the slides maybe moved a little too quickly for me. Oh yeah, here it is from Healy and Berry, politicizing energy justice. A just transformation of the socio-energy system is also a decision to live in a different type of society, not simply a low carbon version of the current one. I was really struck by that, and I have a couple of questions that might stem from that. First, you identify climate justice as drawing on many things, but you insist that it must have an engagement with history, which as a historian, that's where you and I intersect and I've been trying to think exactly when and where we met, but I know it wasn't a discussion about environmental justice, which influenced my earlier work, certainly, even though I am not at all an expert in environmental justice at all. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the historical trajectories which, as you see it, inform the current articulations of climate justice? You've done a really exceptional job in this talk and certainly in the draft writing that I was able to read in telling us what they mean. But I'm also curious to know, what is the trajectory? How do they get to these meanings? At what point, on whom are they drawing, even before an idea of certainly before a term of environmental justice existed, but maybe even before some of the frameworks that you identify or even the perspectives came into being. What is some of the deeper history of that? In some of my earlier work, I make an argument that we could look at late 19th and early 20th century public health movements in Black communities in the context of infectious disease as being environmental justice in a certain way, not at all like they happen in the late 20th and early 21st century. But also say is that I'm very much interested in the trajectory, and if you could speak a little bit about that, and then in tandem with that, what are some of the ideas that have fallen by the wayside? What if we're with all the aspects of climate justice that you've identified, you've given us the package as it has arrived, but what fell out? At what point in, say, 1991, were some of the movements that you study going in one direction, and then something happened, I don't know, maybe in 1993 that said, okay, we need to change our strategy and also change our philosophy. So if you could kind of enrich some of the historical trajectory for us, I think that would certainly help me understand it, maybe, and hopefully perhaps our audience as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I was thinking about this. I think I came across your work because I thought infectious fear was a prehistory of environmental justice to me.
That's very kind of you to say, and yes, thank you.
It's an amazing book that I still use all the time. And so for me, when I see the anti-tuberculosis movements in Baltimore in the early 20th century, it's the same arguments that the asthma activists in Harlem are making in the 90s. And so I think you're exactly right. And I'm not a historian, but I read heavily in environmental history and radical geography. And so I think that your question is really, really important. And one of the, I just edited a book, a special collection of American Quarterly in September 2020 called Energy, Past, and Futures in American Studies. And there's a few cases in there, a few of the articles, which were fascinating because, if you think of energy as the capacity to do work, and then you think of that in the context of enslavement, there are some really fascinating, like there's one piece by Nicholas Fiore, who I think actually is from Colombia, called Plantation Energy, From Slave Labor to Machine Discipline. And then there's a piece by another scholar about W.E.B. Du Bois's relationship to alternative energy, in the early 20th century. So there has been a long tradition of Black engagement with the politics of alternative energies in the late 19th, early 20th century. But actually, if you take it back, many of the papers in that collection were talking about plantation economies through the lens of energy. And then actually there's a rereading of like Sidney Mintz's the idea of sugar, and the transformation of carbon and energy itself. How wide do you look at, energy is not just about oil. That's the dominant way that we think about oil. Energy is the capacity to do work. And if you open it up like that, then you start to see all kinds of things in different ways. So and then even more, I would recommend, I'm self-interested because I was an editor of the special issue called Energy, Past, and Futures in American Studies. Some of the, we got a fantastic, very mixed literary and historical set of papers that approached a lot of what you're asking about, which I had not thought of or read in that way until it was framed through this special issue. So things around indigeneity, obviously, nuclearism, and more contemporary work too. So there's a video game where this indigenous, I think she's Anishinaabe video game designer, has like an oil strike, and it has to do with like the Dakota Access Pipeline as well. So there's a lot of both contemporary cultural production, but also like deep historical work where scholars who are interested in these questions of enslavement, indigeneity, land dispossession, are rethinking these historical events and through a frame of energy explicitly. So I think that's really fascinating. And I would send people there, like, for example, I did not know about Du Bois's alternative energy stuff, so I guess this question of what's left out, from 1991, I think there was David Pellow, who's an important scholar in environmental justice, talks about, the really radical parts of the principles of environmental justice that got kind of left behind in the 90s. And I think a lot of that had to do with, broader, and, I was young at that time, and I could see a lot of these discussions too. There was a lot of debates about, what do you call it? So, the civil rights movement and sort of the deep South roots of the environmental justice movement was calling environmental racism, legacies of civil rights, and so on. And then it kind of got more broad to be environmental injustice, environmental inequity, the really radical politics that talked about capitalism kind of, and workplace rights kind of fell behind as there was more institutionalization. And we're in an interesting moment where a lot of that has sort of come roaring back. And that's what Pellow is saying, is this critical environmental justice. And so, and my attempt to say that there's a critical climate justice is, indebted to Pellow's critical environmental justice book that just came out, which is, again, not to say that, there's false environmental justice and this is the real radical one, but to say that these things, sort of go in waves of what's sort of acceptable to talk about, what's acceptable to think of as within your frame. But I think those are really important questions. So I don't know if that's enough.
Thanks.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and by the way, by mentioning, questions that I have been interested in some time ago, I was not trying to place my own work in the genealogy, and certainly you were kind to say a prehistory. I'm not sure I would even agree, but I'll take it. Thank you for the compliment. No, I was just using that as kind of as a prompt to really think about, the other, prehistories, as you put it. There is, I'm interested kind of like in a for want of a better phrase, maybe an epistemology of climate justice. And what made me think of this is you mentioned your college years and your first engagements as an activist and as a scholar with this work. And you said, I guess maybe speaking maybe to our younger viewers in the audience, keep in mind that this was before the internet. I remember that period as well. I think your students and mine also can't imagine that period. But it occurred to me, and you said it's before GIS as well, and it occurred to me that I was left thinking or asking a question of, to what degree have emerging technologies helped frame this perspective? Because you're very clear that it is one that rejects not just neoliberalism, but as I've read some of the other work that I've found, a lot of aspects of just kind of liberalism, really. You're very clear that you reject, or certainly have a distrust of what you called solutionism and technocratic, governance. And I share that distrust with you as well. Even while I am, fully believe in science, and I'm not at all a science denier. But so are there technological developments? This is another history question, I guess. Because as I've understood EJ movements, environmental justice movements, which I see as a kind of precursor to climate justice. I could be wrong on that as well, and please correct me if so. As I remember it, that when GIS comes around in the 90s, it is quite literally a game changer. That there are, call it solutionism or overly zealous empiricism or whatever have you, but that these were ways in which movements could say, we have data, not just complaints, for example. And I'm not characterizing them as having complaints, but certainly you can imagine EPA administrators under the Reagan administration, just saying, oh, they're just complaining. But that, my understanding is that when data shows up, it's different. The United Church of Christ issues that report in 1987, I think it is. So is there in this new book any sort of meditation on a technology that got us here, and maybe where it goes forward? You know, I mean, as a Kim Stanley Robinson avid reader, you know, I love his speculations about what technology can and may not do for us. So, okay, I think that was more an essay than a question, but somewhere in there is a solicitation for your comment.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, when you get to a certain age, I feel like most of what I do is remind students that there was a world before, you
Or
know,
TikTok.
before hegemonic neoliberalism, before before the internet, you know, before. And I think there's a lot that is great because about the moment we're in. I think actually social media is a big, you know, so I think like 5 years ago is when I feel a lot like my students are coming in and a lot of my students know about redlining now. You know what I mean? And before you'd have to do a lot of like description or, you know, and now people are coming in with that. And I think in my optimistic moments, you know, when I see the changes on my own campus, you know, which has historically been a very like mainstream, one of my students was like, you know, we are training to be neoliberal managers of resources, you know, but then like a lot of them are like, hey, but we're never learning about Standing Rock or Kettleman City or what's happening in the Central Valley. And, you know, so more people are sort of politicized in that sense, you know, and I think, some of it is related to demographic shift, at least at the University of California. You know, I know it's different at Columbia and at other institutions, but you know, the life experiences and the perspectives of the students coming in is more, you know, amenable to thinking about these problems. And also, so I think there's an opportunity, especially as this Columbia School is, you know, getting off the ground, to really make sure that the curriculum reflects, you know, those politics and reflects many different kinds of epistemologies, including indigenous. I mean, I didn't really talk about indigenous environmental science. There's a lot of that work that's going on. A lot of, you know, the wildfire response in California has been like, well, indigenous burning practices, which were policed, you know, so heavily for so long, you know, and the fire, Jake Kozitz, you know, piece in his book, you know, he has a chapter called Smokey the Bear is a White Racist Pig. You know, so people are kind of going back and reading that and saying, oh, well, you know, indigenous environmental science, like even if it's not called that, that's what it is. That's a form of restorative environmental justice. And so I think there's more of a curiosity and openness. And, you know, it's been interesting. Again, I'm not going to overgeneralize from my own experience, but, you know, obviously I'm in the state of California. Cal EPA is really taking on these questions of like, okay, well, we know that the state was involved in redlining. So what do we do to address this from a permitting standpoint, from, you know, the work we do as regulators, you know? And so, and I see this, I also sit on the Delta Science Council, which is trying to think about these questions as well. So again, that's where, you know, the provocation, which I didn't really spend that much time on in the actual talk, is like, we're in this moment where it's like, okay, well, we kind of understand, not we, like everybody agrees, but like, you know, it's more acceptable. We understand what the problems are. Now, how are we going to approach them, and how does who we approach in that actually also matter? You know, and the politics, how we do the work. And I think in that sense, this is why I think the 30 years of environmental justice, like relentlessly doing this, is so important. You know, the one thing I see in a lot of my students who, especially in the wildfires, who haven't really, you know, imagined their lives as being vulnerable to violence and chaos. You know, there's a kind of a widening out of that perspective that environmental justice and racial justice activists have sort of said, you know. And so I think one of the lessons, again, you know, that I really tried to drive in is that you have to have hope in the face of all of that violence. If you just give up and, you know, then the game's already lost, you know. And so it's the structure of feeling, it's in the fight itself that I think is like the single most important lesson from the climate justice, environmental justice movements.
Yeah, I really liked your your point. You made it this evening, and then also in something that I read recently about the non-naive hope. Was it? Correct me if I'm wrong. I know non-naive was the key word and that really signaled to me that there's also a strategic thinking that goes on here. I wanted to ask you a bit more about that, but I'm also keeping an eye on the time. I don't know if Daniel can tell us how many questions we have in the queue, but I certainly I have a long list of questions I could add to this, but Julie, you and I are overdue for a catch up at some point, so I'll just pitch them then, or maybe I'll sneak in during the Q&A. Melinda, should we or Jason, you're handling our Q&A, is that correct?
I can. I think Pamela may open it up if people want to raise their hands. I think now we'll if people are already putting their questions in the chat, so please go ahead and do that if you wish. If you want to raise your hand, do that as well. Are there any questions with hands raised, Pamela, before we pick ones off the chat?
Yes, Will Gifford would like to ask a question.
Okay.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really lovely to hear from you. And I'm a current graduate student at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, but I'm an alumni of the University of St. Andrews, and so delighted to see Darren McCauley get a shout out in his work in your talk. When you were speaking, I was thinking a lot about a piece that I had to read for one of my classes here by Jovan Scott Lewis, who's at the geography department at Berkeley, and he talked a lot about. He wrote a book called Scammers Yard very recently, talking about Black Jamaicans claiming reparations through scamming. And what I thought was very interesting about that book and related to yours was the talk about the race and colonialism and bringing these together with the idea of reparations and justice, but also how he framed reparations as redefining the terms of a relationship. And what I wanted to ask you is, in your talk, you seem to define the end goal of reparations is freedom, or you use that word a lot, sort of an emancipatory project. And I was curious what you think we gain from that versus thinking about reparations as a sort of redefining an ongoing relationship or a new type of entanglement instead of just a separation from that. Thank you so much.
That is a wonderful question. And I wasn't aware that this book was out. So now it's on my screen and ready to engage. The reason why I talk about freedom so much is because it is an overdetermined word in the US. And we could see this in the debates around like freedom to wear masks and all this kind of stuff. And I'm also I cut out a lot here, but there's a book called Uneasy Freedoms by Libby Onker, who's a political scientist at George Washington University. And that book, and I think Neil Ahuja's book on climate refugees are two really important ones for me to think about. And so what she is talking about is why we have to rethink the way that freedom has been sort of the dominant ways that it's talked about politically, as in political discourse in the US, as individualist, as masculinist, as the right to not have infringement and so on. And she talks about, and obviously this is a broader conversation that's not just Onker's, about what freedom is from and what freedom is for. And so I think that for me, talking about freedom is useful because when I was showing that just transition framework, when it says extractive economy, regenerative economy, I think in that sense, it's the freedom from and the freedom to. And so there's a vision of rethinking the ethics, the politics, the relationships around work, energy, food, care, and all this stuff. So that's why I use freedom, because I think it's an important politically and also theoretically. But I do want to read more and think about these questions of relationships and Jovan's book. So as I said, this is just the beginning, but there's a lot to ponder there. So thank you for that.
Pamela, should I go to written questions, or do you want to take a few more raised hands?
Yeah, there's one more in the with a hand raised. Val, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, of course. Well, thank you so much for such an exciting conversation and panel. So I speak to you as a Columbia alumni and a climate organizer, and I applaud the climate school. However, I wish as a Master of Architecture grad and someone who studied urban planning and who looks at climate through the lens of the built environment, I really wish that Columbia University, along with NYU, also took more seriously its role as the largest landlord in New York City. I wish the university took steps to foster a just transition within the built environment of the university directly. Do you have advice for those who may want to confront the university in advocating for a just transition internal to our institution, its relationship to the land it occupies, and as a node in a network of other similar institutions? You may think of Harvard and its ongoing divest movement. How can we build this conversation internally? And how can this movement come in coalition with the drive to unionize graduate workers?
That's
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really important set of questions and provocations. And, I think that, you're bringing it up raises them. And I hear, I was thinking about Ashley Dawson's work on public power and energy democracy. And so I think there's a whole network of folks in New York, that if you're not, I'm sure you already are connected with those folks that, would be very interested in how to, again, practice this in the homes that we live in uncomfortably, the institutional homes. I think, the new, what's the Aronoff book? What's the Aronoff book? The new Green Deal, what's it called? Do you know? When I cut it out of the talk, but they talk about the real Green New Deal versus the faux Green New Deal, and they talk about public housing and jobs guarantee, and it's a very utopian, vision of land and labor and food politics, which I think is pretty fascinating. So I would say, I'm sure, the many of you who are activists on this already are familiar with that, but for those of you who aren't, to really think about, what these politics mean on the ground. And part of it means like, okay, we're not just talking about like, how do we get, people to drive, electric cars, do you know what I mean? But and how do we get people in public housing to, use more blah, 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 it's about community control and about assets and, access to resources. In the special issue I was mentioning, there's a lot of work in places like New Orleans that is really radical in terms of thinking about energy collectives. And not through private ownership means. And so, I think there's so many great models of what's happening. It's almost overwhelming. And so, to learn about what's happening, and then to say, okay, well, this is useful in this context. And of course, Columbia, NYU, there's my colleague Davarian Baldwin has written an important book about the relationship of higher ed institutions and development and urban development, its role and relationship to Black communities. This is, at the University of California, there's a lot of new understanding about, how the public university, the land grant universities were built and sold on the theft or sale or the theft of native lands. Then how that land back movement is connected is the political response to this, like, this goes back to Sam's point about like, well, those historical records, from the Morrill Act have been around since 1862, right? What the digitization and the report on High Country News does is to visualize them, across space and time in ways that have never been done before. And so again, this is not just University of California, this is all land grant institutions as well. And so it's actually fascinating. So if you look at like Cornell University, for example, what they can do is to say like what individual parcels of Indian land in California basically funded the growth and sale and the development of Cornell University, all across the country. And so you see this like movement of capital that's based on theft of native land. And so then the political movement is land back, right? Or trying to think about, they have this thing about how do you quantify, this parcel to this, what's the growth over 150 years of time and stuff. And so, I think we're in this moment where people are using the technology to understand history across space and time. And then the political question is a political question, and that's an organizing question. What does this all mean? What are the demands that come from it? And so, I don't know what that looks like in the case of New York, or Columbia, NYU or Columbia, even though I'm from New York and I went to NYU, I've been thinking about this in the context of, University of California. But I think this is what is going to be happening. These are the discussions that we're all going to be having, for the rest of our lives, and so it's best to, know what's happening, and then, to be training the next generation of scholars and activists and community members to like, that's where the knowledge is going to come from. Like what should be demanded comes out of that, I think. I come out of a movement framework. I was an organizer as my first job out of college. And so that's my orientation. That's how I see the world, and I think that, for me, and that's why that's the climate justice has to be frontline fence line. But, this is the terrain of what we will be fighting about from now on. It's just, if we don't know that, then, we're just going to be blindsided. And that was the curriculum, part of that was always so upsetting for me at UC Davis, which was the big industrial ag, campus. We were, graduating hundreds of environmental science majors who had no training or background or introduction to environmental racism, environmental justice in California, which is a really active environmental justice movement, just like unethical, as a, pedagogically, to be training people and have their first encounter with a community group and have no background on it. Do you know what I mean? And so that's why, ethically, just from a sustainability or climate justice curriculum perspective, we have to be foregrounding these, and the answers will come from the relationships and knowledge sharing that emerges from that. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Really interesting. Thank you. We only have 10 minutes left for a couple of questions that have come in writing. If other folks want to raise their hand, Pamela will call them as well. I'm sorry I don't have the names of who these questions came from, but there's one that relates to, I think in my intro up front, we talked about many aspects of phrases like environmental justice, climate justice, just transition, who bears the cost of the impacts of climate change. But there's a question here related to who bears the cost of the transition itself. So it says, we've discussed climate justice as it relates to the impact of environmental degradation on vulnerable peoples, but a big part of the current climate movement also focuses on the impact of the energy transition on blue-collar jobs. How do you see these two lenses intersecting? Is the focus on blue-collar workers a recent development, or does it relate back to earlier movements? I see this as a question from Juan Jose Guzman. So the idea that some people will be dislocated by the transition, and how do we think about that when we talk about a just transition?
Right. I mean, and just transition, the term, and the first time I came across it was, was around labor. It was around the labor issue in the late 90s. And, Jose Bravo was director and is still director of the Just Transition Alliance. So labor and, the idea of rejecting the dichotomy that this was about oil versus, jobs versus environment, which is, a broader conversation in the 90s that was happening. So it was always about labor and about protecting the transition and having the opposition from blue collar workers and union workers to not be a thing that stops the transition from happening. So that's it's gotten just transition, like organizationally, that's where it comes from, like the labor movement itself. And then just transition itself got much broader and capacious, but it's always been focused on labor. And I think there's a lot of really important work in California. California has a very strong oil and refinery economy, which most people don't think about because they think of California as a certain type of thing. And the role of what is going to happen with those oil workers in the counties in the Central Valley is a very central part of the agenda and conversation. So there's a lot of discussion about this in California. And how to centralize, what are the policies that are going to be put in place in terms of supporting the workers, how do you replace, union jobs, how do you, what are the education transitions that have to happen and so on. So I think, I don't know what it looks like in other states, but I know in California, and a lot of this obviously has to do with the strength of the environmental justice movement in California in general, groups like Center for Race, Poverty, and Environment. But I think, I don't believe, I'm just guessing, this is not as big of the conversation in, say, Louisiana, but that there are those parallels, those conversations have already been happening. So, there are lessons that can be learned from, those conversations as well. And again, we all know that you can't just regionally transplant these things. There are local, cultures around, in the state level and also the regional that shape this. But in California, certainly the answer is yes. The question of labor and blue collar jobs is a really important one in just transition.
Yeah, and not just domestically, but internationally as well. We're obviously thinking a lot about Senator Manchin these days, given the central role he plays in U.S. climate policy, and around something, I think it's around 50,000 coal workers that are in the U.S. now. There's 500,000 coal workers in India. When you think about some of the parts of the world that are going to have to take a quite different approach to economic development, if we don't want to exacerbate the climate crisis, there's real issues there as well. There's a question from Sarah Cole. The emphasis on the emphasis on radical hope is intriguing. How do you reconcile the idea of radical hope with the current and future realities of climate catastrophe?
Well, I think, I try to have non-naive radical hope myself, whenever I feel despair, because you read the reports, and in some ways the book is me arguing with myself. About the possibility of a non-naive radical hope. But to be honest, it is remembering the stories of activists who have been fighting this for a very long time. And so whenever I feel like, the nihilism and despair, and many have written about the Sarah Jaquette Ray's book, Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, is an important book. And she talks about, how her students literally can't imagine a future. You know what I mean? And, what does that mean for your capacity to, that the anxiety we feel interpersonally is a social one, and what are the political implications of this? And so I think for me, reading and understanding the politics of affect, through works of scholars like Sarah Jaquette Ray and Libby Anker, but also, again, me being grounded in environmental justice movements, there is never a sense of hopelessness in environmental justice movements. There just isn't. And so, whenever I feel any of the twinge of that, I just think of Elizabeth Yeampierre, like just basically like butt slapping me and being like, come on, get off, let's dance, let's eat, and then let's fight more, And so, and I think that's like I said, the most important lesson for me is that there is struggle and there's hope and there's humor in communities that have been, targeted for death. And I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because I think the people who are feeling hopeless are people who have never really faced like relentless death and despair, like constantly, and so that it's an unfamiliar feeling that feel like life is out of control and there are institutions and power that you are not accountable to you. Well, welcome to, the experiences of many dispossessed and abjectly abused people in the US and in the world. You know what I mean? And I remember in the 90s, again, like I said, all I do now is tell stories about 28 years ago. You know what I mean? But I remember I grew up in Chinatown in New York. I'm a working class, Chinese person. And I remember going to Berkeley and there was Cop Watch, because Cop Watch, you had big things like this. It wasn't like everybody wasn't a videographer. Do you know what I mean? And I remember saying, why would you need to watch the cops? Think about that. Sam's laughing, Sam's eyebrows, right? How could you think that? Do you know what I mean? Well, I thought that because I was a working class Chinese person and I understood anti-Chinese racism, but I did not understand police brutality against Black communities. I didn't. It wasn't part of my experience, right? And so I remember that naivete. And so that's why I always end with the James Baldwin quote. Do you know what I mean? Because if you know what's happening and then you still continue to go beyond, then you are the monster, that thinks it's okay. So I think we're in a moment historically where, like with George Floyd, a lot of people who had never thought about that were me in 1991. What? You could just murder somebody on the street and nothing will happen. And this happens all the time. Do you know what I mean? And so I think the non-naive radical hope I have is that there are more people who are like rejecting that, as like, well, that's just the way it is. What Tyler Wall and David Correa called cop speak, that this is just acceptable. Of course, they're afraid, you know what I mean? And so, then this is where, the work of anti-colonial writers in the early 20th century, are talking about like rejecting the authorities and the voices and the capacity to tell those stories, and that's why, for me, I think I just went on a total tangent. Do you know what I mean? I like to reveal that story only very selectively, but it's also to say, like, we are in the moment where we cannot have innocence. You can't cling to your innocence anymore, or you can, but that's not going to solve the problem, right? And so I rather throw down with the people and the movements that reject those things as inevitable, and to say, look, I don't have innocence because either I directly experience it or I understand the world of and experiences that are not directly my own, and I'm not okay with that. Do you know what I mean? That's where I have non-naive radical hope. Like it's all the people in the street going, not okay. This is not okay. So that's how I continue to have non-naive radical hope.
Really fascinating conversation. I'm sorry we're out of time. I'd love to talk about this for quite a while longer, and really appreciate the questions that came in from the audience in writing and those who raised their hand too. So really want to thank both of you, Dr. Z, Dr. Roberts, for being with us. Really fascinating conversation. Pamela, I think we have a minute or two left to wrap up. I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you all very much for joining us tonight. And thank you so much, Dr. Z. Thank you so much, my friend Sam Roberts. And also thank you, Jason, really for your thoughtful moderation here and sharing. I hope that you'll join us next time in November for our next event. We have 2 more in the Climate and Society series this semester. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.